Okay, we have heard a lot of information at a lot of different levels. Mark talked to us about the ability to synthesize data into action and meeting, and information as insight, data as a window. Brennan talked to us about some of the policies and practices at the state level. Rebecca talked to us a little bit about her research at the district level and how to empower teachers. Rebecca, when I was reading your paper that you wrote on this topic, there was a sentence in there that really captured me, and that was, planning, implementing, and sustaining an ongoing process to utilize data to improve classroom instruction is one of the most difficult jobs educational leaders face. And I think everything that we've heard today sort of captures why that is. So I want to start out with a broad question that, based on your individual roles and experience, can you give us some detail about the kinds of conditions and supports that really need to be in place for teachers to achieve this goal of empowerment and data literacy? And Elliott, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. Irina, I'll go to you next, since we haven't heard from you two, and then we'll capture everyone else as well.
Sure. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for being here today. It's very interesting to hear the different perspectives on data use. I'd echo a lot of what I heard earlier from Mark and also Brennan and Becca. The piece we were looking at, we moved in both districts that I worked in and in Colorado from being about the data itself. So we kind of create these reports that were pretty flat. And just to get that in the hands of teachers, that was the first time we even thought about, and mostly we delivered it to principals. We needed to create some ways, though, for that data to make sense. And some of that is asking the end user about what they need, what kinds of things they're looking for, and how that might, how we could help them do that. In districts that I've been in, we learned the most from watching how teachers would organize data in their classrooms. Somebody mentioned, I think it was Brennan, data walls. And while we provided these reports that we thought up at the central office or at the state level and we thought were brilliant, when we brought them to teachers or principals, they weren't as useful to them as thought. So we did a lot of work by watching these data walls, or how teachers organize their grade books, or how they put together observations, and started to try to figure out ways we could make that process easier for them. So that they could utilize this data, and trying to move to a spot where the data comes to them in real actionable ways. The second piece is thinking a lot about what kind of guidance they need. So to start off with, we had to have some ways of walking them through these different ways that we have visualized the data, so that they could get at the questions that were most interesting to them. But the end product for us was to really get where teachers could get data that they could reorganize themselves, put into forms that worked for them, and answer their own questions. So what they were really looking at is not the data itself, but very quickly making it actionable for them in the way other folks have talked about. A piece that we might talk about a little bit later with this is the emphasis in data use for a long time has been on large-scale assessment that provides the least information for classroom teachers. The data is usually not timely available, or available in a timely way. So we tried to work real hard to start off with this saying, you need to look at that data very fast and then be done with it. So if we're fooling around with these large-scale assessments in September, that's even too late. We need to look at it very quickly, make the best use that we can, and move on. But as we move to these more short cycle kinds of assessments Rebecca talked about, or even to formative practices, and I'll push on that a little bit later, that are a lot less formal. They're observations, sometimes they're just questions. How to organize that data for teachers and make them available to make sense of it quickly is something that we need to do a lot of. It also raises incredible issues about data privacy and how we record these more informal pieces. So I'll stop there.
So I have to say that as a principal, I have been called all kinds of names, and Ninja by far is the best one. So thank you, Mark. That's great. So as a practitioner in a middle school, one of the challenges that I'm dealing with all the time is building teacher capacity to use the formative and summative data in their instructional practices. So there are really three paradigms that we have been focusing on. The first one is building trust, first and foremost. We know that teachers, unless they feel that they're not going to be immediately judged by their data, are not going to open their doors. So for us, building that sense of trust and community in our school, where we're all instructional leaders, allowing teachers that time for cohort planning, team planning, grade level planning, and then staff planning, and really letting them open doors, engage with each other, and know that numbers are not representative of their ability, and they're not immediately labeled as effective or ineffective teachers. So trust has been first and foremost. The second bit has been the transparency. So creating a culture in the school where all the teachers, parents, and everyone in the schools are allowed to participate in the ongoing process in terms of instructional rounds, having teachers go into different classrooms, collecting various forms of student, parent, and teacher data, informal observations, formal observations, and when we're looking at those various data points, making sure that, again, we're not signaling certain teachers out, we're not using this for punitive reasons, but we're really focusing on our instructional focus to move all students forward, and then to build our own capacity and differentiation in meeting the needs of the kids. The third important paradigm piece has been this the teamwork process, where we are working with each other in a cyclical way so that throughout the year we are honest and we're committed to each other and to our students. So the process that Rebecca mentioned earlier, the plan, do, study process, where we have our focus for the year, we conduct our root cause analysis, and then throughout the year we're meeting and having those engaging conversations that look at the whole school, but then more importantly where we dig a little deeper and look at the specific subgroups and the students whose needs we need to meet.
Mark, in your work, I mean, you're outside the system. Can you share a little bit about your impressions, sort of coming in from the outside and working with district leaders and teachers?
Yeah, we've been working the last 6 months on producing dashboards for district administrators and district level curriculum people, and in doing our validations and field research, there were two kind of opposing polls that really came out of those conversations. One is that a condition for success, I think Elliott mentioned this, is the data needs to be personal. People like to explore in their own way. They like to see things in their own way. So the ability to take data and kind of reposition it as information that matches to personality and style turned out to be really crucial to people's willingness to engage. Kind of almost in complete opposite contrast, and a few folks have mentioned this, we found that because of all the barriers that everyone has mentioned, that whether it's at the teacher level or at the district level, people are successful with data to the degree that there's an environment that's collaborative, that they need a committee, a team, a group, a community of practice to really surround the data process before it works for them. And we found over and over again that it was the ability for people to come together in useful ways and explore the data together that made a huge difference in their perceived value from it.
Something that gives me comfort in that. That the idea that there's all this data out there, but in the end, people still really actually need to engage and come together. Yeah. Becca, you know, you talked a little bit about professional learning communities. Can you put in a little color to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I've done quite a lot of research in this area, and in one study I facilitated in one mid-city district, I looked specifically at teachers in PLCs who are trying to use data and evidence to facilitate improvement, and in teachers who are in effective PLCs, they pointed to 3 things that their school leaders did that helped them to actually use data effectively. They said they understood what the role of PLCs were, they understood the expectations from the school principal for how they should use that time. They received tremendous amounts of professional learning on how to actually use evidence effectively in PLCs. So it wasn't just professional learning provided by the district level, it wasn't just reading they did when articles were popped in their mailboxes, but it was through professional learning done school-wide. And the third thing was I also had a school culture focused on learning and collaboration. Irina spoke to this. We've heard this mentioned a few times. It's not something that you can just start doing immediately overnight, but how do you really show that the leader is learning the work with the teachers, that everyone's learning together, and then making changes in their own practice and their instruction. So by actually putting those three things in place, PLCs have a great possibility of being able to be successful to use evidence.
Brennan, how about from where you stand? How does the state policy stuff fit into all this?
Absolutely, and I'm glad we went down this PLC route. I think there's a lot of different things states could do, but one example that we've seen is one state, Delaware, and it's a state mandate, so some people are going to take it, some people will leave it, but required that every school in the entire state, which admittedly isn't that many schools, but nonetheless, had 90 minutes per week of planning, professional learning, community, data-driven collaboration time. So they either had to take it in two 45-minute blocks or one 90-minute block, no 9, 10-minute blocks of the week. And I'm sure that it was implemented with various degrees of pleasure, happiness, and efficacy, depending on what your culture was and how you felt about the state requiring you to do it. But nonetheless, here is a state where every single teacher in that state has 90 minutes to sit down with his or her colleagues and talk about how their kids are doing every single week. I think that's tremendously powerful and could be replicated. I'd love to see somebody else do it. Colorado, maybe?
So two of the things that I wrote down when you guys were doing your presentations was I wrote down the word access, because that came up a lot, and then I wrote down flat data with a little sad face next to it. And Elliott, I think this might be the point you were making earlier, is it seems like that when people access data, oftentimes they will access flat data. So what do we need to do, or how can we change that so what they're accessing is not as flat and is more usable and is more nimble? And I don't know if this was your point about the large-scale assessments versus short-cycle testing that's less formal, but this idea that the data that you have access to is actually data that you want and data that you can use. And we have so many different levels in education, so I'm thinking at the teacher level, but in some ways I'm also thinking at the principal level and at the district level as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? Sure.
Maybe I'll use our state as an example. We're a local control state. I know every state's a local control state, but we hear that a lot. So maybe we can't mandate what Brennan asks us to do, even though it's a great idea. But we've done something at the state level. We have a data access point called School View, which is kind of a pioneering piece when it was put in our state. And basically, it does a couple different things. And it starts out with just reports on schools that parents, anyone can access off the, you folks could do it right now if you want to go to schoolview.org or go to the Colorado Department of Education and access Schoolview. And underneath that, it started out with just a series of flat reports we hoped were useful to parents and to practitioners, and we did some work on focus groups and some other pieces trying to determine whether those were useful, and we've worked on some. Most of them are color-coded, so they go a little bit from, they're really not reports, they're much more of taking school and district ratings and breaking the indicators down and enabling people to see where schools did well and not so well and so on. But we've also moved that beyond to where individuals can access data sets, for lack of a better term, that they could pull off, use, reorganize themselves. If they want to, they can take a look at a variety of different variables and sort those pieces. That takes some sophistication to do that on your own from the state, but the first piece was making that access available to lots of people in a way that's helpful. Another piece that's pushed us a little bit is through a state-mandated piece, actually under ESEA, where we have a unified improvement planning process in which schools and districts get training from the state to think about how to analyze their data, look for root causes. A lot of the pieces that Rebecca talked about that give people some opportunity to dig into this data and look at it with some guidance. We still have schools and districts where the Unified Improvement Plan is assigned to some poor schmuck who has to write it and turn it in. But hopefully those pieces are, I'm sorry, I have been one of those in the past, so I guess I could and where we're trying to make these real and living documents that allow people to look at this large-scale data and then think about how I'm going to use interim and formative pieces to monitor progress over time and use those. So part of it's providing some training to help people feel comfortable with looking at these pieces and creating a lot of different ways that folks can access data in a variety of forms depending on their level of sophistication and how they might use that.
Mark, can you add something to that?
Sure. Well, one of the things that you see generally about this flat issue is that when people start to have rich, visual, vivid alternatives, they go to those places and use those sources, and it raises the bar. This happened generally in the web and internet world. We've seen over the last 10 years this whole notion of infographics, and you go back not that long ago, and what did we see in newspapers and magazines? Lots of words, lots of flatness. What you see today is kind of almost predominance of visualizations in this infographics forms, and USA Today, New York Times, Washington Post have really pioneered being able to present information in tremendously visual forms. So what we're seeing is that some states are leading by example in this way. West Virginia, for example, uses the fan visualization that I showed, sends it home with every student to every parent as a way to begin the kinds of conversations that center around visualizations. The other point I just chime in on what Elliott was talking about, because of the power of data, what you see is that access is a problem that tends to solve itself over time. And we're seeing that. Technology makes it so easy today to collect and disseminate information, but access isn't real without literacy, and that's this point that it's not so hard for us to enable people to extract and find data. It's really, really hard to enable them to do that in ways that they can make use out of it and understand it. And so I think our biggest challenge going forward is in a world where the data will be out there, how can it be out there in ways that make access genuine?
Interesting. Irina, can you talk a little bit about that, about this sort of triangle, if you will, of access, literacy, and trust, and maybe give us some real flavor from your examples in your school or in your community?
Absolutely. So I think when I think of data, I think of bags of groceries, and you can come home with so many fabulous grocery bags full of food, but it doesn't mean you're going to end up with a great dinner. And I think same terms with data. Our teachers have on an average 150 students. They have cohort planning every several times during the week, team planning. They have staff meetings, and so they have very little time to really sit down and digest that data. So it's critical for school instructional council members, for administrators, to be able to sit down with teachers, use their time effectively, and then really pinpoint the specifics from data points that can be used over time to meet students' needs. I think sometimes when we look at data, we look at a specific target point and we address it that time, and then we check it off and we never look at it again. So I think it's really important to put systems in place that allow us to look at things over progression of time, and then to look at specific kids and be able to engage in those rich discussions. So when we have cohort times or instructional council times, when we sit down and we look at specific data points and then engage in those conversations, and we follow up through the professional learning cycle and through our professional learning community with articles and with those rich conversations that really allow teachers to feel confident that they can use the data to improve instruction and build their own capacity, so when they go back to the classrooms and the door closes, they're able to meet the needs of the kids.
So I want to ask a question about time, because this has come up a couple of different times. Sometimes in our work at CEP, we've actually just did a report on expanded learning time. We talk about the tyranny of time, because it seems like it can be such an oppressive force for educators. So when you're thinking about data, and Mark, you talked about this when you talked about the sweep of time with the Vietnam Memorial. And Brennan, I want you to chime in here too, because from a policy perspective, people's realistic ideas about how long change takes, if you're looking at data as a way to determine whether or not there's been change, how have you struggled with this issue of time and getting people to understand the appropriate timeline for the data that you're showing them in terms of understanding what it means? I don't know if my question is cloudy, if I'm making sense, but you've all mentioned time in a different way, so I would love to just hear you speak about that in terms of data use, where it can be a challenge, where it's helpful. Anyone who wants to chime in first on that one? That came out of left field, so.
I'll just jump in a little bit. I'll say some heretical things that you can't repeat anywhere about it. We have an incredible growth model in Colorado. It's been used by a number of states, and Renaissance uses it very effectively. And some ways of getting other data to our schools real quickly. But the ultimate utility of that is you could look at our growth model and say, this kid grew a lot, this kid didn't, compared to their academic peers. That's about it, if you get right down to it. So then you got to figure out why. So the issue of time is to make these large-scale assessments easily accessible, quick to understand what they tell me, both looking back and looking forward, as Mark said. That's really important. And then to move on to other assessments that are more important. And so I was thinking about Rebecca's description and how it manifested in your school. When you go watch teachers who have some capacity and they're in an environment where they're encouraged to do this, interact with this data in a PLC or a learning community of some kind or another, that's where the real work at this comes, and it doesn't feel like time to them. They have a picture of a kid on the wall, they've got all this data around them, or however they personalize it, then it's exciting and important. It's when they're looking at these the state information, even if it's large-scale information, even if it's not flat and I can get to it quickly, I got to not spend much time there. I got to have ways to make the data that teachers are collecting on a more short interval basis get to them quickly, so their time spent thinking about what do I do about Elliott because he's here, and what I do about Brennan because she's here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would just add that, and this has come up a few times, is it's so easy to just focus on the students because you have limited time, but it's so critical to focus on what school leaders are doing differently and what teachers are doing differently as well. And when I think about that cycle of how do you go through a school improvement cycle, at the very basic level, plan, do, study, act, how do you actually begin to put in place the professional learning that you need to learn to do something differently to address student needs, and not just talk about the student, which can sometimes become a conversation of blaming the student, but actually bring that evidence of, okay, what's the strategy I use as part of our instructional goal to change what I'm doing to meet this student's need, this student's need, this student's need? How do we design a common assessment so we can actually measure whether we see some student progress? How does the school leader in the district provide time and resources for one teacher to get into another teacher's classroom to see that strategy they tried, that they saw some results from, to see if it, how is it working in this classroom? How are the students with the greatest needs participating, engaged, learning, to then be able to know whether or not that strategy should be used by more teachers or whether it should be refined. So it's just so critical when you think about the time that you need to do this work to build in that time for teachers to really learn and for school leaders to facilitate that learning, because otherwise it's looking at kind of one student or two students but not knowing, okay, what did I actually do differently? You need to have that time to be reflective and to be able to turn the mirror on yourself and look at your own practice to be able to make this work over time.
And I think if I could just add to that, it's absolutely critical, and that's part of that teamwork cycle, allowing teachers and the language that we use. So we're not talking about students, we're talking about what are we doing as educators to meet the needs of the kids. And then when we're going into the classrooms, really looking at the teacher strategies, and so looking at instruction not from what the teacher's doing at the center of the classroom, but what are the kids doing. So if we're looking at structured student discourse, are we walking throughout the building as a group and looking for strategies to engage students in that practice? And then coming back and talking about it as part of our professional development and using that data to improve teaching and learning. So it's absolutely critical.
Brennan, let's get your state perspective too here.
Right. So I think time is maybe the biggest issue we have in education policy writ large, right? I've heard people say, the tendency of a teacher who's been in the classroom for a long time, just, shut the door and this too shall pass. And so if you're not in this deeply embedded culture that we're hearing reference, where the PLC and the collaboration and the using information is just part of practice and good instruction, it's going to be really easy to shut your door and hope data and PLCs and new standards and new assessments and whatever else is going on in the new SEA, whatever else is going on in the school just passes. Because we're always ready for sort of the next thing and the next reform, the next idea. And so we need to create a policy landscape and also a practice landscape that is sort of sumptuous and gives time for things to take hold and for people to not feel like, well, this too shall pass, but instead, this is something that I want to be engaged in.
Yeah, maybe put an optimistic spin on the notion of time. Google and Renaissance did some work over the last year to look at how teachers are spending time. And what came out of that study was an enormous opportunity for data. It turns out teachers spend 8 to 10 hours a week on lesson planning. They spend multiple hours a week on some of the issues of core administration. When you add up all the time that they spend not actually doing instruction, it comes out to about 30 hours a week, right, which would be a full-time job for folks. So one of the opportunities we have, and we've seen this in other disciplines with knowledge workers, is to use the power of data and technology to lessen the burden of those kinds of tasks so they have more time to put in around the kinds of productive use of data that we've talked about. And there's a big time opportunity to create new tools and new process that are more infused with information so that teachers spend less time on the mundane things that are occupying them today. And I think ultimately this is the kind of trade that will drive data literacy to new levels, is when we can, as we've done with people in other professions and other fields, give them a lot of value from information that saves them and rescues them from the trivia that has been occupying.
Interesting. I'm gonna ask, on the Twitter chat we had a question that's sort of a micro of this, and I want to ask Irina and Rebecca this. One of the people who's been following this says strong data literacy needs lots of training. Can you give us some examples of small steps that educators can make today to use data effectively? I don't know if you have any personal experience, either one of you, and you work in the county, that can maybe speak to that.
Actually, I can start. So one of the things that we've had to do is to really first begin by increasing the capacity of the administrative team and our staff development teacher. At my school, we have an incredible staff development teacher, and we work very closely together so that all of our plans for the year-long staff development for the staff, for instructional council, and for our teams is planned months in advance. It's research-based. And it takes a tremendous amount of work. So when we are meeting with teachers, we're using their time effectively, and it's all research-based with specific goals, always guiding back to our root cause analysis and our instructional focus for the year.
So in thinking about the professional learning you need to really use data, one of the first easy steps you can take is just find some protocols to help guide a conversation when you're talking about data with other teachers and with other leaders. How do you make it safe? Well, here's our kind of guide for how to actually talk about it. So instead of just handing the data or putting it in the mailboxes and say, okay, talk about this at your next cohort meeting, here, I'm going to actually go through this protocol with my whole leadership team, as Irina said, or with the instructional council. We're going to use it together. Then when I go back to my grade level or my team, then I'll have had experience going through this data, looking at it, and now I can actually help lead others to look at this data together. And National School Reform faculty, DataWise, lots of other resources out there have tremendous numbers of protocols that you can use to help guide that first conversation so that you can think about, all right, what can we learn through looking at data, and then determine some next steps to actually make a change based on a focus area that you select for your work.
We've talked a little bit and have heard a little bit about our challenging and beautiful education system that has a strong element of local control. And as a result of that, we have teachers, we have principals, we have district leaders, we have state leaders. So some of the questions that have sort of come up about data and empowering educators through data use, finding agreement on what matters, this idea of what data actually matters, Brennan, I think you said this in your presentation, and we all know it to be true, data is power. So who controls the power in that list of people? And then the ever-present static, I call it static, about data. Privacy, just the pervasiveness of technology in our own lives and how that influences our opinion about data use in schools. I think, the parent group is really at the epicenter of this. It sometimes, I think, is very difficult for them to separate their feelings about technology versus their feelings about how technology and data can help their own children as students. So how do you manage these multi-layers of control and these complex issues? Now, I don't expect an answer to that very detailed question, but what I'd like is just your impressions and perhaps your own personal experiences of how you've interacted with that challenge in your own career. I think it would be interesting to hear for people to hear from your own experiences how you've managed in and out of that. And again, when I ask questions like this, I let whoever wants to start.
I mean, no one is struggling more with this in the country right now than I think Colorado. So we're all
it's nice to be here.
Yeah. We're all sort of watching and learning from you. I mentioned when I was presenting is that a lot of the things that we've been doing in education, including data, we've been doing them for a long time, and there's a lot of really smart people, SEAs, and at districts for that matter, who knew this was going on and who were really working hard to improve it. There's been great support and incentive from the federal government to do this work, and we kind of forgot to tell everybody else. It has not always been the strength of the state education agency, and arguably even the local education agency sometimes, to really communicate in really plain language with the people, with parents, with their constituents, if you will. And I hate to say that communications and the right talking point is a silver bullet, because certainly it isn't. But we all, everyone in DC, meaning the feds, meaning organizations like mine, meaning the state, meaning the district, meaning teachers in the classroom, need to have some really clear ways to talk about this, because people are scared a little bit. And you're right, there is this technology that's out there, and there's bad things that are happening to companies. And so if we don't start talking really proactively and clearly about the value of all of this, we'll lose it. We'll lose it.
I think as a principal, I see my job in so many ways is to protect my teachers, to buffer them from sometimes too many things that are going on from outside and also within the building, and then always to make sure that we stay focused. So really to keep that eye on the prize, to know where we're heading, to remember that all of our work is about the students and meeting their needs. And so it's that balancing act and knowing what we need to use to move forward and knowing what we can put aside for the time to get us where we need to go.
Mark, I was wondering, as the presentation that you did to me was so interesting, do you find that if you're dealing with people who are negative or nervous about what this all means, does talking to them about data in a way that sort of tries to get at the meaning behind it, has that been helpful? Does it resonate more with them?
It has. I think you have to start with the value and the win, and make sure people begin with the shared mission of accelerating learning and enabling students to succeed. And when the conversation kind of proceeds from that common goal that everyone in the dialogue has, there's hope of achieving understanding and resolution around these tough questions. At the same time, the fears are genuine, and they can't just be addressed by talking about the win alone. They have to be coupled with meaningful and sufficient reassurances about the processes and approaches to protecting students. And I know we're seeing an enormous amount of energy and effort in the vendor community in this regard, both voluntarily and from individual companies. We're also seeing this at the standards level, and we're seeing it at the legislative level. And I think all three of those levels are important to create, an atmosphere of trust. More than anything else, we have to make sure that we are communicating adequately about all the things that actually do go on to protect privacy. I mean, there's just an enormous amount of energy around this issue when you really dig into it, but sometimes it's not that visible to the parents and folks who rightly fear abuse.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to chime in?
Add a little bit. One of the things that caused this to be such a fear in Colorado was one of our largest districts had an agreement with In Bloom. Some of you may have heard about that piece, and that was an attempt to provide teachers with lots of different sources of data in an easily accessible way, and a way to look at it and sort it and so on. And it caused a lot of issues around privacy that we eventually walked away from state sponsorship of that effort. Yeah. What we've found in dealing with this is we have a fundamental assumption that the only way you could ever guarantee absolutely that you wouldn't have issues with privacy is never to use data, ever. Don't collect it, don't use it. And so there are some folks that say that's a good idea. But we try to take precautions that most reasonable people would say, yeah, that makes sense. And a whole lot of it's been around transparency. We found when this In Bloom piece blew up, which was a year ago last fall, is what we saw was a lot of we weren't very transparent at the state level about what we collected and how it was stored and what kind of contracts we had with different vendors, and in some cases we didn't even know. And so people had a very, I think, they ought to be concerned about that. Mm-hmm. So we've tried to be real transparent. For example, every contract in which we share personally identifiable information is on our website. You can go look at it and so forth. We have a summary. But now what parents want to know is, no, I don't want to go through 500 pages of a contract with some vendor. I want you to give me a summary that tells me what data you have, how you store it, and so on, and how it's going to be used. And then it trickles down to the school, because we use a school readiness measure called Teaching Strategies Gold, for example, which is an old observation piece that's been around forever in preschools, where teachers used to write observations, and now they videotape them. And the technology of that has pumped that up to a much higher level, where folks are going, what are you doing with these videotapes of my kid, and how long do you keep them, and all the rest of that. And mostly folks want to be able to trust that you're taking the appropriate precautions and that you're being honest with them. So we've had to work real hard at times of saying where we might have made a mistake or where we need to get better, and let parents in on that piece, but still operating under the assumption that to use data for improvement, as these folks have talked about, is a good thing. And we're going to continue to do that, but we'll take the precautions we think we need to, and we'll work with you to hear what your concerns are.
I'd just add that it's important for school boards and school districts to consider, too, what types of data and evidence should be shared beyond the school walls or beyond the district walls. When you're really doing this very difficult work of changing practice to lead to instructional improvement, it's great to be able to have parents, central office team members, a team, all part of the work together, but that doesn't mean that whether you saw practice used in one classroom and not in another one should be on the front page of the Post the next day. Okay, how do you create a safe environment where the principal, where teachers can feel as though they have time to learn? Because changing something you've done for the last 10 years isn't something you can do immediately once you've had one professional learning session. You need to be able to have that time and safe environment, as do students, to really be able to make that change, to be able to show the results. So the cards that Brennan talked about, one teacher using in DC about students' behavior, pulling it out and moving it to a different part of the apron, that's not something that needs to be publicized beyond that classroom, yet that's critical evidence for the teacher to know how are the students doing. And that's part of what creates the safety around using evidence, is knowing that it's okay for me to learn. It's okay for me to ask for support so that I can actually do this better as I'm trying one thing out and then maybe switching my practice a little bit next week or tomorrow.
So we all know that the generation factor matters in terms of technology. For those of us who are old. Technology sometimes presents more of a challenge just because there was, a time of our life where we didn't have it. So I think about teachers, right, and the range of teachers in a class. And we have some teachers who've been teaching for 20 and 30 years, for whom all this technology and all this data is new to them. And then younger teachers coming up the pike. So I guess my question is kind of twofold. Is one, based on your experiences, how do more seasoned teachers deal with these changes, as you just said, Rebecca, that take time to learn how to incorporate these new strategies? But then do we feel like the teachers that are sort of coming up the pipeline now are really being trained how to do this? So when they get into the classroom, they're really ready, that this is something familiar to them. And just, Rebecca, why don't you start, and then maybe other people can chime in based on their experiences.
I think Brennan made a good point on this earlier, that to a large degree, the ways in which universities, including my own program at GSHED, and the speed by which teacher training programs and school leader training programs change is as required by the state. And if the state requires that teachers who are earning a certification have a course in data literacy, by golly, teachers are going to have that knowledge of how to do that work. Unfortunately, sometimes you're competing, if that requirement is not in place, you're competing against other universities, other teacher training programs, and 18 credits are required here, 30 credits are required here. Well, can we add this other course even though we know it's critical? That's the unfortunate reality of how do we make sure that we attract students but also prepare them with what they need to know. So I would say that we're certainly, at the university level, we certainly know this is a critical area for our teachers to learn about and for our school leaders to learn about. The challenge is how do we make that change, and how do we not only make the change, but all universities and all preparation programs make the change so that we can ensure that every teacher coming out has that knowledge.
Yeah.
I am not, if I can,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I am not seeing any trends that show me that my younger teachers are better at handling data than my veteran teachers.
Yeah.
What's nice is that all of my teachers are engaged in professional development, and my veteran teachers are the ones who are leading, calming the younger ones down, reassuring them, modeling for them, and then really implementing the data and aligning them with instructional practices. And that's the really nice part to see when you have a teacher who's been in the classroom for 15, 20, 30 plus years, as I have teachers in my building who are able to say, here's the data, we have students, we need to differentiate, and this is how we could do it, and let's go walk around some classrooms, let's see how it's being done, let's use the information to help us engage the kids and build our own capacity. So I think in terms of instructional practice, you can have teachers who have been in the classroom for quite some time who are learning themselves. And so many of my teachers have multiple degrees. They're taking courses online. They're engaging in summer workshops. So I would say it really comes down to individual teachers and their commitment to the kids in their classroom.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in and say that in our field validation, we've learned not to confuse two incredibly different competencies. It's absolutely the case that sometimes younger educators are more comfortable with the hardware and the mechanics of technology. And oftentimes when we produce these kinds of visualizations and reports, we'll hear from the veteran teachers, well, where's my print version, right? Just show me how I get this on a piece of paper. And you may not hear that as much from folks who are growing up with a screen. On the flip side, when it comes to data competency, I think our research shows the same, that it takes experience, it takes time, and oftentimes, interestingly, what the research shows is that at the end of the day, what we talk about as data, it boils down a little bit to math and statistics. And all of our research shows that teachers in particular have a much higher comfort level with words and English and literacy than they do with math. So we struggle in general that some of the core competencies to cope with data are not necessarily the things that come most naturally for your second or third or fourth grade teacher.
I'll plug too that there's a friend and colleague at WestEd is doing a case study for educator preparation programs to see the evidence of how are they embedding data literacy into the training, and she, if we're here, I think would be much more skeptical of the degree to which that any teachers are really getting access to that. But I think what she's finding is, just like in schools, that there has to be a culture within the program that values that level of instruction and sort of make sure that it's embedded and it's not a one-off thing. And then, perpetually the bearer of bad news today, there's also been studies, however, that no matter how much training you might give teachers on the front end, if that culture, and I mentioned this when I was talking, if that culture within the district and schools, if they're to support it and promote it, they'll lose it. They'll stop doing it because it's too exhausting to look at data by yourself. So we need that whole continuum that I think is not quite there yet, to make sure that teachers feel comfortable with using this information, that it's not a one-off, and that it's just part of good practice.
Can Elliott and Rebecca, can you speak to that?
Just jump in for a minute. I do get the technology divide. When I first came to the department, some of my younger colleagues asked me if I text, and so I get that part. But I do, yeah. But I would put assessment literacy kind of goes hand in hand with data literacy, and I heard folks talking about that. I think that's an important piece. Even if you don't need to understand validity and reliability, you want to know something about the quality of an assessment, is it telling me some pieces. But one of the things that's been successful from a state perspective, and builds, I think, on what Rebecca was talking about in preparation programs, Brennan, is we have a state teacher evaluation model that under statute, districts either have to use a state model or have one that approximates that. And one of the major components of it is reflection on their practice. And inside that is a whole lot of using data. Some of it's qualitative, some of it's quantitative, to think about the things that you've heard folks talk about here today, and be able to gather artifacts that demonstrate that. And to be judged highly effective or an effective teacher under that system requires you to engage in that process. And so that's been pretty powerful, because we're not seeing any difference anecdotally, is what Mark talked about from his studies, that younger teachers somehow do this better. It probably depends on the program they come from and whether that's valued. But there is a piece about this trust that's so important, whether it's at the school level or the teacher level, and you guys have said it so well. Sometimes when schools or teachers present their data, people go, aha, and they jump on it. Yep. And that's the worst time, because you're asking people to show the things they don't do well, mostly. And that's a real step up for folks, as opposed to going, I wonder what's up with that. And so they can think about it in the kind of cycles that Rebecca talked about is really important, and that trust is so important. And the way you describe it in your school sounds wonderful, like you immerse yourself in that and you get to grow, versus people are trying to figure out what you did wrong.
Rebecca, before you answer your question, can I just throw one other thing in there? Is if anyone works in a district office, forgive me, but people have said that district offices really are one of the hardest places to sort of get an environment of continuous change, that it's difficult to get a level of transparency within the district office. Have you, as you answer your question, have you found that to be especially challenging?
So we, when I was in Montgomery County Public Schools, we actually tried to model that same process at the district level, but it certainly takes time. It's, again, something that you're not necessarily used to doing, that is looking at your own practice and thinking about what are the types of evidence we can bring back to actually utilize to show whether a principal made a change based on the support we provided. And yet it's so critical, is being able to think about what's the evidence that we need to collect to know whether we're making a difference. And some of it seems simple, but whether a principal is administering surveys to students or to teachers to ask them how did they experience professional learning, or how did they change something in their practice after they actually had a professional learning session. We could also do at the district level, is asking our principals, how much of an impact did we make on what you did next based on what you learned during this session? Can we come in and see what you're doing? That's, again, more evidence around how are we making changes. And part of this work from the central office level, too, is really partnering with our principals and not just, again, being that compliance organization, as we've heard mentioned so many times today, but how do we actually partner with them to make that change and model the change, as we're asking our principals to make with their teachers. And as part of that, I just wanted to highlight that all the evidence on professional learning is that it needs to be context-based, on the job, job-embedded. So whether our veteran teachers and our new teachers are learning together at the school level, this new practice and how to use data and use the new parts of technology, or whether it's a member of central office partnering with a school leader to actually do the work together, plan the agenda for the next instructional leadership team, plan the professional learning that's going to take place on this topic. It's so important for all of that collaborative work to take place to then lead to a change in instruction. So it's one thing to be exposed to it, as Brennan said, starting with the beginning of the course when you're in that program, but then how do you actually use it in practice? That collaborative culture has to be in place across the school and at the district level also.
I've been bogarting all the questions, so I'm going to give the audience a chance to have a crack at it. Again, with this light, it's a little difficult for me to see, so if you have a question, will you raise up? And we have people with mics who can come to you. Yes, ma'am. Susie, if you can.
Hi, I'd like to ask Ms. LaGrange to expand on the instructional rounds that you spoke of. Are these perhaps loosely patterned on medical education? And could you tell us how the rounds fit into your data-driven decision making? Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. So our instructional rounds are based on our instructional focus, and we conduct them throughout the year. So about twice a month, sometimes more than that, we collect a group of staff members, and when we meet in the office, we have our guiding questions, and then the teachers who are not part of the instructional council, they're the ones who get to select the classrooms that we visit. So they're not predetermined. The teachers pick the classroom, and we review exactly what we're looking for once we go in the classrooms. We know we're not writing down the teacher's name. We're not writing the period of the class. We're really looking for instruction through the lens, through the paradigm of the students, and through our focus. And teachers go in the classrooms, we take notes, we're not intrusive into the lesson, and then when we come back, we process the learning. So our staff development teacher guides the questions, and we talk about the instructional practices and the student learning that we saw that aligned with our focus. And then we're able to process the delta of all the great things that we saw. And then we also look at the areas where we need to grow. And we share that at our upcoming instructional council meeting. And then we bring it all back to our staff meeting. So at the whole staff, we're able to say last month we conducted this many sessions. These were the things that we saw that proved to us that we're moving in the right direction in terms of our instructional focus. And then here are some areas where we need to grow. And this is the learning that we're going to engage in over the next few months to help us build those skills. And then that work is done at the department level through our content specialists and resource teachers, who then guide that work with the support of the staff development teacher and the administrator.
How much did you consciously model medical rounds in the process and procedures that you use?
How much do we model it?
Yeah, did you look at the way that hospitals do medical rounds? Because it's a very similar...
Yes, it's based on that, exactly.
It's based on that, yeah.
So we did a lot of reading and studying. So as a principal, I had mentors from central office who came in, who trained me and who worked with me and who helped guide that work for me. So this is not something that I did on my own. It was absolutely... it was first building my capacity and my administrative teams and the staff development teachers, and then having us go into the classrooms. And so one thing that we're going to do next year, we're going to bring kids into the cycle, because we really think it's essential to see what are the kids seeing and how are they experiencing the learning, because when we go into the classrooms, we're not engaging with kids. So next year, students are going to join us on this process and provide us with the feedback.
That's great. Any other questions down here?
Hi, thank you all. This has been a very good discussion. One concern I have is that even with the principles that DQC released, and if there are school board policies that Rebecca mentioned to protect data, that the more data that exists, the greater the potential for misuse. And I'm not just talking about invasion of privacy. I'm thinking of, there was a story in the Washington Post the other day about a parent in Loudoun County, Virginia, who was suing to release some teacher evaluation data that the state doesn't even use because they think they're inaccurate. So how do you protect against things being, just because it's publicly available data, being released in inappropriate and out of context ways?
Right. And I think I hear this pushback on transparency a lot, that, you know, if it's taken out of context or a bad actor gets hold of it, that it's not useful data anymore, or we shouldn't collect it. And I'm glad you brought up the state legislative work. And this is why I keep talking about we have to communicate and we have to demonstrate value. There are trade-offs, there are balances absolutely to having data, to collecting data and using data. And I don't think we can only exist within a framework in which we fear bad actors or fear misuse. We have to create the policies and practices that promote good use, provide systems and structures for protecting, securing, and appropriately releasing that data, and then have possibly even consequences when people misuse that information. And a little bit less of a sort of a draconian perspective, a lot of times I hear people, they're concerned with putting data out there because the media is going to get on it and say something bad or say something that's not quite right about their school because you're putting out your weaknesses a lot. One thing, again, small state, but what we saw in Maine is that their state Department of Education was tinkering with some new financial information that they were going to put out, and their district said, fine, we'll work with you on this, but you need to train all the reporters in the state to understand this data and how to use it and talk about it. And so they ensured that their reporters are data literacy. And we're chuckling because the reality of that is tough when you get bigger, but you have to balance that there's value and there's good both in transparency and use, and make sure that the frameworks are in place to protect against bad action.
The only thing I'd add is that this struggle to collect information that makes the world go round while preventing it from being abused is not unique to education. It's been a plague for the financial services industry, for the medical world. At the end of the day, you have to have a veneer of legislation and governmental regulation that creates the right kinds of boundaries. And I don't think any industry has been able to navigate through this core problem without this combination of top-level legislation, consortium standards, and then a lot of self-regulation at the individual enterprise level. And it takes a combination of those three things to make it happen. But when you see the lawsuits emerging and the kinds of stories that make us all cringe, it's usually a sign that the legislative veneer that's required for success is not yet in place. I lived through this in the financial services world, lived through it again in the healthcare industry, and at the end of the day, education just tends to lag behind, partially because of all the emotion that's attached to it that we've talked about today.
I might add one piece to that. We have kind of a prime example of that in Colorado, although it's occurred in other states. One of the biggest issues for parents is that not so much that this private data is being shared and somehow you're finding out stuff about their kids. It's an issue for them. It hasn't happened very much. What's happened a lot of, all of a sudden they get something in the mail advertising for their kids. And they're going, how'd you get my kid's name and know that these products would be useful or something that might appeal to them? And what we've had often, and this is going to be passed in our legislature soon, is that a teacher will go to a conference and they'll run into a vendor, very well-meaning on both sides, and then they'll say, you want to try out our product? Well, just send me your kid's class list, we'll plug it into our software, and then it gets distributed. Mark that. So we have a bill in the legislature that looks like it's going to pass with bipartisan support. Brennan knows about these across the country, that puts the onus on vendors to have in their contracts with schools, districts, and why that may be overplayed a little bit, in our state, and I'm sure it's true in a lot of the states across the country, we have 178 school districts, and over 100 of them have 1,000 or fewer kids. So the technology coordinator is also the math teacher or somebody else, or that they get to come in and do this, and they don't have the the expertise to think about how to protect this data or what to even ask in these contracts. And so that could probably be a helpful piece in the long term. I don't know.
Several companies have also signed on recently to a student privacy pledge that I would
Including
encourage.
Renaissance,
Good.
yeah.
I was worried I was putting you on the spot. Good.
No?
That is taking that extra step of a statement that they are committing to this set of principles, and it's enforceable. So we are seeing, I like what you said, that the legislation hasn't caught up yet, but it's getting there, and the standards are getting there. There's conversations in states, there's conversation on the Hill about updating FERPA. The companies are taking action. The reactions to this, I think, have been positive work.
Can I ask a cheeky question about this? And Irina, I want to get your reaction too. When you hear people's concerns about privacy and parents' concerns about privacy with testing and some other stuff, one of the things that always makes me scratch my head a bit is that, their kids have iPhones with Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, blah, blah, blah on them that reveal more privacy and more data than anything in the universe could ever. Do you ever find that parents want to engage you in this conversation about parents, and how do you help chip away at some of those misperceptions and misunderstandings about data use?
Yeah, so we haven't had, I spent a lot of time dealing with kids and their misuse of data and the drama it causes in my building, way too much time. So from that point of view, that's been my collaborative piece with my parents and my community. My parents have not been concerned about our misuse of instructional data. But if they did have some questions, I have an open door policy, and I would be willing to engage them in those conversations. And I think as parents, they have every right to question us and to make sure that we're doing the right thing for their kids, and I appreciate that conversation. I think in terms of the classroom, one thing that I'm cognizant of in having the conversations with my teachers, that we're very mindful of our own belief systems when we look at the data, especially in terms of kids who are meeting the targets or not meeting the targets. Because I think sometimes there can be that danger of looking at the data and saying, well, then it's those kids, and those kids can or cannot do, and it's really not, I don't own it. So I think it's really important that we're always reflecting on our beliefs, on the way, on the ownership, and really ensuring that the data is about us and instructional practices and never about the kids. And that's something that we work, that's part of our process and ongoing conversation.
That's an interesting distinction, that the data is about us and not about the students.
Always.
That's really interesting, and how you can actually make that distinction in terms of how the data is used. I think that's a very helpful way to think about it. Any other comments on that?
I just have to add, too, how many people in this room have Facebook? Like almost everybody, right? And so from being on Facebook that there's some people that share everything, and they post pictures of their kids, and they tell you when they're on vacation, and they're searchable, and there's other people who sort of are bystanders and watch it and click the occasional article and aren't searchable. And so we all know from living in this digital space that the way people understand and interact with privacy is very individual and varies across a wide spectrum. And so we're seeing that bleed into education and other sector conversations. So I think on some level it's nice to have that little local understanding because we're on Facebook, but it also helps us think about what's the tension, what's the pain point here.
I might add one piece to that. It's
Sure.
interesting when you say that. When I was a teacher, we collected personally identifiable information on kids. We had sensitive information, and we stored it in a file called a file folder. And it was stored in a database called a filing cabinet.
Yes.
And we didn't take very good care of those pieces at the time. It depended on who was in control. So if the person working in the counseling office, maybe where those are stored, followed procedures to lock them up every night and do that thing. But a lot of times teachers will go down and look at these files and leave them on their desk or something. It's the technology that's caused us the problem with this, because if there were some sort of leaks or breaches there, I might talk to Brennan about the stuff I saw in this kid's file. Maybe that's inappropriate, but I might do that. But now they go viral. As soon as any of that information is released, that's what really gets us into trouble. And so our ways weren't very effective of keeping them secure in the past, but technology has just exposed that a lot more.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
This is kind of a long build-up that I promise wasn't a question. Thank you. So we're actually GSHED students, and we're currently working on evaluation of Delaware and their professional learning community support system.
Oh, good.
And so it's been really interesting learning about their system, and they've got it down, and like reading previous evaluations, and teachers are mostly, for the most part, really bought into that. And then on the other hand, my mom is a teacher in North Carolina, and she's an elementary art specialist, and she would really like to be working with this data, but we were talking a couple nights ago about our project, and she was saying, you know, we're supposed to have PLCs once a week, but usually they're canceled because it's the only time in the day the administrators actually get a break. And so, like, unless there's something super pressing that they want to tell us, like, they just cancel it. And even when we do have them, we don't talk about data. They used to give us the school-wide data so that we could inform our practice, but not anymore. That's been, you know, years since they've done that. And it's just such a wide divide. And so my question is there a way, that's such a small microcosm, but is there a top-down approach to really, I don't know if that's a North Carolina issue or if that's an administration issue or a district issue, but does it have to be, you know, a bottom-up approach where you really have to have your teachers buy in and your administrators buy in and then up from there? Or is there a way that we can take a national approach and say, you know, nationally we really want every state to be engaged with data and to have this really strong program, and you have to do it in a way to kind of make sure that trickles down? Which approach would work, I guess?
I can start off with that question.
Is she one of your students?
No. Good question. So the work has to, and this is not going to be as clear of an answer as you might like to hear, but the work has to take place from both directions. The school leader really has to have a clear vision and provide that professional learning around what needs to happen in PLCs, and that school leader needs to learn how to do that from central office or from other supports within the district to help them to be able to lead this work. And it's really important that PLCs are all moving in the same direction with their work, that teachers and PLCs are asking questions about their practice, but hopefully asking questions aligned to one instructional focus, aligned to one reform initiative, because otherwise you're not going to be able to track the results of what you've actually done differently to know if it's had an impact for kids. So that work has to be led by the school leader, but then really has to be shared across the entire school. It can't be, the school leader can't go, you know, as we said, teachers are used to closing doors. Well, 30 years ago, that's what a lot of our principals did too. They went and wrote the school improvement plan on their own, and then they sent it into the central office. So how do we actually engage the entire leadership team, the entire staff in this process of identifying what we need to do differently based on our student needs, which reflects what we're not doing well. But then it can't just be an agenda handed to a PLC of teachers and said, talk about topics A, B, C, and D in this meeting today, because then the teachers aren't having the opportunity to ask questions about what they're seeing in the classroom relative to their area of focus. So how do you prepare teachers to be able to engage in those conversations in a productive manner so that they can begin to lead them? And how does that work begin, not just with the principal or with, you know, one third grade teacher, but maybe with the team leader or with the department head so that they can serve as initial facilitators of this work?
Yeah, I'll just chime in and say that there's an incredible kind of magic around any work process that is hard to separate around this top-down and bottoms-up idea. When you go look at any group of people who are working well together and following a process well, it looks like it's bottoms up, because that kind of engagement requires empowerment, and it requires that the people who are actually doing the work are completely in agreement with the process. But when you scratch the surface, what you discover is that that empowerment didn't happen by accident, and that at the end of the day there was one leadership that pioneered and trailblazed that process, and two, that there was an environment and a culture that was created that continues to reinforce that process. So typically what you see is that you can't impose these ideas, but you have to have leadership and policy that facilitates the empowerment to happen. And it's a really hard cycle to untangle once you see it in operation. And I would compare this to what we saw in the manufacturing world, where people scratched their head for years to figure out why Japanese manufacturing works so much better and produced at a such higher level of both quantity and quality than manufacturing in the rest of the world. And you'd go to a Japanese plant and you would notice that the workers there were engaged in the assembly line process in ways that were completely foreign to Detroit or Bonn. But it did not happen by accident that that level of engagement existed. And today, what you see is that that kind of manufacturing ideal has replicated itself around the world. People have learned the formula to create worker engagement and make that happen. So I think you just have to credit the magic and work both sides of the top-down, bottoms-up dynamic till you get what you're observing in Delaware.
Interesting. Great question. Any other questions? Yes, here.
And thank you for the time, and thank you for sharing a lot of your experience and knowledge. I work in community health and child nutrition, and we have a lot of growing data and growing information around the impact on food insecurity, community violence, on youth development, but also their performance in schools. And I'm wondering how educators and administrators use that type of information and data to communicate how that affects their students and communicate what schools really need to address those issues for their most vulnerable students.
What a great question. Anyone want to tackle that?
Well, yeah,
It was the idea of multiple forms of data.
It is, and I think the most interesting data analysis we're seeing, Elliott mentioned the growth model. Some states are using a value-add model, and both ideas are, at their core, they're meant to disentangle the issue of performance from the issue of growth. We know there's so many factors that educators can't control, that the students themselves can't control, that ultimately contribute to achievement levels, and to some degree those achievement levels are wired in, by age 4 or age 5. But what we can hopefully measure with sophisticated data analysis is growth and value add. We can get at how much are the schools compensating for those difficulties and creating the most out of the opportunity that the environmental factors give them. And it's definitely part of having a lot of data from different perspectives to understand student backgrounds, student demographics, student socioeconomics, and to factor that into the overall equation when you're looking at any of the kind of conventional data sources.
So I think if I also understand you correctly, you were asking about the wraparound services.
Yeah.
So at the school level, we most certainly have our administrators who work closely with the counselors, who work also with personnel from central office and other agencies within the county to meet the needs of the kids. So there's information that's shared with teachers to an extent, and then we collaborate to make sure that we are working with the parents and that the parents have the resources that they need to support their children. So it's definitely, there's the academic piece and ensuring that we have that rigorous environment. And then also you want to make sure that you're meeting the needs of the whole child. So the social emotional piece is just as important. So absolutely the administrators serve in the role. So as the principal, I also have a grade level. I think it's really important that I'm engaged at that level. And so I have my grade level and I meet regularly with the counselors, all the teachers on that team, the team leaders, and we have personnel from the county who come in and help us support the kids.
I just add from a state level, we've struggled with the quality of that data. We ask schools or districts to report on these various incidents. We don't have a great way of classifying those. We have a bill going through the legislature right now to separate out sexual assault from other kinds of behavioral issues at the school. So when these things get reported in the paper, they try to link it back to your school. People have a hard time interpreting this. Okay, if they turn in a lot of assaults, does that mean the principal is really tough and that's good? Or if they don't turn in very many, does that mean it's good and the school is safe? Or people just look the other way? It's hard to make sense of it from a state level, at least right now for us.
Well, Good.
Oh, I just want to, you got me thinking, talking about that whole picture of the whole kid, one thing that we're starting to see momentum for, and it's actually on the books, a law in California, is this collection of chronic absence data. So this concept that just average daily attendance doesn't work, and that you actually have kids who are missing like 10 and 12 and 15 days in one semester, and that's tremendously detrimental to their learning. And different kids are chronically absent for different reasons. And so when you have that kind of whole picture data appropriately at the student level, that, you know, this kid's missing school because they're hungry, but this kid's missing school because of transportation. It's that digging in and not jumping from problem to solution, and saying, what are the services, what are the needs of the different groups of kids or the different individual kids that help us get to the learning, to the outcomes that we want.
There's also certain types of data that are really critical to look at school-wide, whereas other types of data are important to look at in the classroom level. When I think about looking at attendance data and those chronically, absent kids, okay, have you tried to tie the students who are chronically absent to their performance on any sort of assessment? Will you be surprised to see that students who have 12 or more absences are actually doing better than students who have been in school? What sorts of questions does that cause you to ask? That's actually happened in one school that I worked with a while back. How do you use that data to help you ask questions? At another school that I was working with and doing a research study with, the principal looked at students who were engaged in after-school activities and found that students who were in one after-school activity performed tremendously higher than students who were not involved in any after-school activities. How do you use these different types of data at the school level to help inform what you might need to do differently versus that classroom-based instructional data, which might help you understand one particular student's need, but also you want to be able to make those changes at the school level too?
That's a great way to think about it. Yes, we have another question here.
This is a great discussion, and thank you. We look around for analogies that could be applied to education, and I think the first one that comes to mind is in baseball, and all the value-added metrics that are being used to make decisions in baseball, perfected by the Oakland A's and Moneyball. And the whole idea is that in using data in a smart way, you'll lead to better decisions more often than not. Well, last summer, the Oakland A's used their metrics and their value-added measurements on their star center fielder, and they decided to trade the star center fielder, save some money, and get higher productivity from the substitutes. Well, it was a catastrophic decision, and the team started to lose and lost a lot and imploded. So here was a case where data was being used, the analytics were great, but the consequences were terrible. And I'm just wondering, we talk about data in education that could lead to better decision making, but there are cases when it doesn't. I mean, inevitably. So I'm wondering, based upon your experience, what you have done when you've used data and, you made a decision that maybe didn't quite work out, and what you did with that.
Such good questions.
Yeah. Well, I think if I can answer that, we don't use data in a vacuum. And one thing to remember, we're looking at kids and we're looking at teachers. So I think that goes back to the comment that I made at the beginning, where trust is essential and those relationships. And I know that data tells us a lot, but it doesn't paint a whole picture. And so it's knowing what will work with a child, and for our teachers, asking them to know all 150 of their kids and to know them well, and then to use different strategies to meet their needs. So I think as educators, if we're cognizant of the little individuals that we have before us, or big individuals if we're at the high school level, really engaging them in that dialogue and that relationship and meeting their needs. And if we do that carefully and strategically, then we can't cause them harm, and then data can't be that tool that causes a disadvantage, but rather supports the kids and gets them on their trajectory where they need to go. So I feel that it hasn't been an issue, but we also spend a lot of time on relationship building and meeting the academic and social emotional needs of the kids.
Anyone else want to chime in there?
I've seen us make some mistakes because we don't consider the data or sometimes misinterpret the data. In our state, we have a state accountability system that ranks schools and districts, for example. accredited with distinction is the highest rating and so forth. If you see who some of the districts that achieve that rating there, Aspen, Telluride, Steamboat Springs. If you're familiar with that as a skier, you know you'd love to volunteer to go observe what's going on in those pieces, especially during the winter. But you also make an assumption then if you took the faculty from Aspen High School and put them in inner city Denver that something would miraculously change, and that's probably not the truth, and it's not to denigrate at all what those folks are doing in their school, but some of what we've wrestled with a little bit is how can we get a more common metric? So should we look at only how school, one of the things we played around with in terms of visualization is redoing our accountability system based only on kids in high need schools, and then trying to say how do districts do, and it's fascinating to see the change in ranking as that. So it may be that we're classifying districts in the wrong way, and we're wrestling with that right now because the way in which we put this together and maybe the indicators don't create a level playing field. That's not to say you lower expectations for any group of kids, but it does say let's look at this differently. It's an interesting question. Thank you.
It's important.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, so I was just going to say that whenever you get into data and numbers, you start to deal with the ugly monster of measurement error and statistical variance. You know, Billy Bean's gonna, and he's proven this, he's gonna outperform other GMs over the span of time. You know, Warren Buffett's gonna outperform other stock pickers over the span of time. Better data probably means better decision making, but on an individual basis, errors happen, right? Mistakes happen. And I think there's two kind of responses that you have as a knowledge worker or a knowledge professional. One is to not lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, the gut and the human instinct probably always has a place in the decision-making cycle. And I think the other thing is that when you make an error, when you see a decision go wrong, it has to prompt you to say, well, what was wrong with my model? What did I miss in this particular decision that I need to improve the next time? And I'm just going to bet that Billy Bean has looked at that trade and said, you know, maybe there's some things he needs to think about the next time around that he didn't factor this time around, right? So it's constant improvement. It's having that iterative cycle and saying, okay, we messed this one up, what can we learn?
It's important to remember too that in educational research it's extremely difficult to be able to actually associate one specific action with a specific result. Causation and tying two things together is very difficult because there's no control group of kids who are not being affected by any other factors at the time that you're making a change. But you can look at correlation, and that's by actually gathering multiple sources of evidence over time, triangulating the data. And if you do that in a very frequent manner, then you're not making a decision based on that's going to maybe affect entire students next year, but you're making a decision that's going to help you to try something new over the next couple weeks, see if it has an impact, and then go back and modify it. And that's why it's just so critical to be using multiple sources of evidence in an ongoing manner to really know that the next step that you're going to suggest for your own teaching to benefit students is going to be the right step before you scale it up to the entire school or before you actually say, hey, this strategy really had positive results and mandate that everyone in the building use it. But you're really trying it over time and gathering lots of sources of evidence on it.
Okay, I feel like I have subjected all of you to the Iron Man of Q&A. So we're going to have one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up. Anyone want to be the last question? If not, I will exercise that privilege. Yes. CEP's Matt Frizzell.
Good morning. Thank you for coming out today. And as we look forward into the summer and Common Core data starts to be released, and now for the first time we have a data set that is between states, within the state, and goes down to the district and school. And I was wondering if each of you could talk maybe just for a little bit about what you're planning to do with this data, or how you're restructuring schools, or outreach to parents at the district, state, national levels, or if none of this is actually happening. Thank you.
Good question.
I'll start. It's not a very pretty picture, I'm afraid. One of the biggest issues nationally, it certainly is in our state, you're going to see the U.S. Department of Education has already given us this permission to extend accountability measures. There's going to be a whole lot of messiness in this data. We're going to have a lot of kids that opt out. They already have in Colorado. That's going to continue. That's not random. It's very systematic in some places. In other places, it doesn't occur at all. So we're not sure who's in the population of the students that took the test. There's also issues with technology that we did the best we could to anticipate, but anytime you go to a new test, there's always bumps and those kinds of things. People forget the paper and pencil stuff, but it was there too. And so there's reasons that kids aren't going to do well in this test or they won't be included that have nothing to do with what they know and are able to do. So trying to make decisions about schools based on, or districts based on that, or take action one way or the other doesn't make a lot of sense to us. I think you'll see in our state we have an accountability clock that says you can't be continuously in a low-performing school or district for more than 5 years, or the state board can take action against you in certain ways. That clock is probably going to be paused. I can't say that for sure, but that's what we hear. We've even taken the stance that the Park assessment can't hurt you in terms of state ratings. It could only help if you can bring data there. But that's not likely to occur, since most the only way to really look at that is some sort of percentile comparison from last year to this year. And the growth metrics even are a little bit shaky. We'll see how those play out. They may have meaning, they may not. So I think you're going to see that put off for a little bit until we resolve some of this national pushback on testing from both students and parents, and decide, at least in our state, we're seeing the pendulum swing back to a little less instructional time involved in that, and some more careful thinking about the utility of those tests. So I think we're not going to see a lot of consequences, but that's just our perspective.
Brennan?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, actually, because just personally, not as DQC, with all the things that Elliott just mentioned, not to mention the Twitter wars and just the angst of Common Core, I totally forgot to be excited that we are still going to have comparable data across the country to understand in a bigger, clearer way how kids are doing against new standards. So thank you. I'm going to go home and feel happy about this today.
Anyone else?
At the school level, we're going to continue teaching and learning. We're going to continue doing the work that we do every day. We're going to wait for the results. When the results come, we're going to process them. We're going to know that our kids tried their very best. We're going to take away what we can from it and then move forward.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if we've completely built a better relationship between education and data, but I think we certainly built a better dialogue about education and data, and you guys have everything in the world to do with that. So thank you so much for contributing your time and experience and energy to this panel. Really appreciate it. Let's give it up.
Thank you.
Before we break, I just want to say a couple of things. That this event is being videotaped and will certainly be available on our website, and I imagine on the website of our partners as well. Our own Rebecca Thessin has written a paper that talks a lot about the issues we talked about today, which will also be available on CEP's website within the next week or two. So please look for that, and we'll also be sending that out on our listserv. Two very important thank yous, though, before you leave. Renaissance Learning sponsored this event and has been just a wonderful partner. I have to say, CEP has enjoyed working with you so much. It's been great. You've been great colleagues and teammates on this, and it's really been a pleasure. So thank you so much for allowing us to be part of this and for being able to work with you on it. It's been really, really fun. I also really want to thank CEP's Susie Pamucci, right back there, who's responsible for all the logisticating of this event and did it so flawlessly. Thank you very much, Susie. Well done, you. And again, just one more thank you for participating. We really appreciate it. And hopefully it's not the last dialogue we get to have. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming.
Yeah.